I realize I haven't done many book reviews or essays analyzing literature publicly on this channel, especially since I tend to keep most of that material to my Patreon, so this one is going to be a little experimental. If something about this essay strikes a chord with you, feel free to let me know. I saw something online last year, and we'll get into what that was and what I thought of it, that presented me with an opportunity to revisit a book that I hadn't read in years, while I was working on some other videos about books I enjoyed. And all this talk about books and reading about books got me thinking about books, and so I thought I'd take a brief crack here at writing about books. Before digging in any further, I thought I'd actually leave a note here at the very beginning about something book discourse related that might be encouraging to some people. I wasn't sure how familiar people who usually engage with my work would be with that sort of thing, so I hope you'll forgive the fortunately brief and unfortunately annoying preamble. I've spoken before about what got me into literature, especially fantasy literature, because I wasn't great at reading when I first started. I mean, okay, you could argue nobody is, but some kids picked it up faster than I did when I was younger. However, it was reading The Lord of the Rings when I was 7 that really instilled a love of reading in me. It's not the kind of book that is obviously written to be accessible to very young people, but I think the challenge was important to me as much as the content. You've probably heard the trite analogy that your brain is like a muscle. It's so overdone that it's practically a thought-terminating cliche, but there's some truth to it as well. If you practice something, even if it's primarily cognitive, there's a degree to which you can improve. This is the kind of struggle that coming to terms with having autism and ADHD really begins to inform. I know being in higher education and needing to read and process dozens of books and short stories every semester killed a lot of the pleasure I got from reading, and post-graduation depression certainly didn't help. In other words, I've been retraining my brain to read, so I really appreciate the perspectives of all the people who have similar difficulties. Just because I talk about loving reading and writing doesn't mean I don't know what it's like to struggle with those things. However, making progress in that has been really important to me and has required a lot of time. Again, I'm sure a number of you can relate. Hopefully this translates well in all the content I make. But beyond reading to challenge myself or reading for the pleasure of it, I see the value in accessible literature, in fiction literature that mostly goes down easy for people who are either just learning to read or who aren't acclimated to more challenging prose, but also contains something meant to expand their mindset or speaks to something that will be important to them. I don't mean to disparage people who read literature that happens to be more accessible for the fun of it. I've done that before. I'm a big fan of a number of the Star Wars Expanded Universe novels, for example, but rather to emphasize that many books have different things they can teach us, and unsurprisingly, that can be reflected in the, for lack of a better word, complexity of the prose in a book. I say this all as preamble, however, because the real point of this section of the essay is more generally a defense of young adult literature, or YA lit. The term refers to books usually made for preteens and teens, so think middle school and high school ages if you're American. I've seen a lot of condescension over the years for people who are avid consumers of the genre of young adult literature. Many people, I can only infer, tend to assume that if you prefer generally to read more accessible literature with more straightforward prose, then you are either not an avid reader or otherwise not intelligent. That feels like the general shape of things. I personally don't think that's true. I do think there are maybe a couple adults on the internet who could probably stand to read another book or try something new, but that's a thought I have every time discourses about art crop up. I myself often feel dissatisfied knowing how much there is I simply don't know, but that's why we educate ourselves and continue to push ourselves. Only doing one thing over and over again until you die might not be as boring for everyone as it would be for some people, but you're guaranteed to understand some of the things you do experience better if you broaden your horizons for the sake of it. This kind of thing reminds me of a fable about a frog who lives his whole life at the bottom of a well, until he meets a turtle who tells him about the ocean. In a way, that's sort of what being a young adult is like. You're taking your first steps into a larger world. I've seen some adults be challenged by young adult literature beyond their comfort zones, funnily enough. This comes in a few forms, but really it's all the same. People don't like the idea that young people, children they'll say, even when they mean teenagers between middle school and high school ages, could be exposed to some ideas. Granted, there's something to be said for things being inappropriate for people of a certain age, and ages below 18 are a fair catch-all for some of that. But there's also subject matters to which some people think younger readers should not be exposed, because it would presumably be too much for their vulnerable minds. This is the kind of thing that adults often take much more severely than younger people, because learning to infantilize is a trait developed over time, and because young people have an understanding of the depth of their own interior worlds, often underappreciated by adults. This was why young adult literature connected with me when I was a teen. Reviewers might take easy pot shots at stories for young people featuring young people that acknowledge that young people feel complex feelings around life and death, family and friends, pain and suffering, and yes, even new feelings of discovering romantic or sexual inclinations. These are topics that can be approached in a mature capacity that will benefit teens, and personally, I always felt seen reading stories that had those elements. Adults might pretend that teenagers are just slightly bigger children who function as extensions of their parents, but teenagers are smarter in that particular way because they are the first set of eyes in their own world, and access to that epistemic perspective deserves respect. The book I'm about to share with you in all its elements is a book that deals in those subjects, which meets younger readers in that interior world and even builds one for them to match. I wanted to begin this way because many reviews of this book, even ones I liked, didn't. They spoke about this book like adults, which is fair because that is who they were, but when adults speak about teens, they tend to treat them not as equal human beings in a different situation with different needs, but rather as people who are behind them in a race. They left the bottom of the well and see the great ocean, whereas the young people have yet to do so. Many young people even find this perspective appealing because, in a way, they feel their own ignorance validates that way of thinking. They can even come to accept the condescension of arrogant adults as justified. I mentioned the fable of the frog in the well earlier because the idea of acknowledging one's own ignorance made that story feel like a provocative parallel. It also reminds me of this quote from another book, Wings, by Terry Pratchett. Quote, "She said there's these hills where it's hot and rains all the time, and in the rainforests there are these very tall trees, and right in the top branches of the trees there are these like great big flowers called bromeliads, I think. And water gets into the flowers and makes little pools, and there's a type of frog that lays eggs in the pools, and tadpoles hatch and grow into new frogs, and these little frogs live their whole lives in the flowers, right at the top of the trees, and don't even know about the ground. And once you know the world is full of things like that, your life is never the same." End quote. It's easy to make fun of people for being ignorant, you see. We ourselves are often drawn to ridicule those things we would hate most to see reflected in ourselves, and we often hate those things which familiarity has seeded with contempt. We live in a culture, supposedly, where we believe in the radical, fundamental act of being one's own person. That requires self-love. How can you love yourself if you hate yourself? It's a contradiction. That is why every time we hurt someone for being like the worst part of us feels like it's being torn up. Cruelty splits the soul. Few books have been in people's mouths when I listen to what they have to say about contemporary fantasy literature more than Six of Crows. Everybody is waiting for George R.R. Martin's next entry in the A Song of Ice and Fire series. All the romance heads get excited when another Sarah J. Maas novel drops. People can't stop talking about how the Witcher books are better than the Netflix series, and all the young adult literature consumers buy up the latest Leigh Bardugo novel. Bardugo is known for the Shadow and Bone series, but has also penned a couple of tie-in novels, one of the earlier of which was Six of Crows. While set in the same world and dealing in a number of the same ideas, the book follows a new cast of characters on a new adventure. I felt provoked by some of the recent discourse to discuss this book, and before we get to that, you need to know about Six of Crows. We start our narrative off with a quick look into the life and times of a guard who works in the mansion of one of the local nobles. I've seen a few reactions to this first chapter where people say, "Who is juiced?" But the character is pretty clearly set up to give the reader some insight into what will be an inciting incident for the narrative to follow. It also functions to introduce the culture of the region and the magical aspect of the world, namely the Grisha of Leigh Bardugo's Grishaverse. I've also seen a few people push back on criticism of this first chapter by saying that if you stick it out, the character of Just becomes relevant much later on. But you see him again very soon after, so it's not like you even really have to wait that long. After that first chapter, we move to the main narrative perspectives with our 6 crows, up to ye olde Black Air Force activities in the fantastical city of Ketterdam. 5 of the 6 titular characters are third-person perspective point of view characters, those being Inej, the ultra-edgy sneaky lady, Kaz, the hyper-competent gang leader, Jesper, the gay Tumblr sexy man, Nina, the in-universe equivalent to an ASMR roleplay YouTuber, and Matthias, the man who owns several coffee mugs with the phrase, "World's Biggest Hater" printed on them. Jokes aside, the motley crew around which the narrative revolves bring a lot of diverse perspectives to the story, and not just because they have different cultural, ethnic, religious, sexual, and gender identities. What I really mean is that all 5 of these characters, the character of Wylan, the rich kid demolitions expert doesn't have a point of view narration, have a particular and distinct flavor to them. Fan favorites in my experience appear to be Kaz, Inej, and Jesper, but I actually liked Nina and Matthias way more. Maybe it's because I'm well outside the target demographic for this book, but the sort of colorful lives of a 17-year-old gangster feared throughout the city for his master planning and intimidating aura, and a 16-year-old former sex worker turned master assassin really don't resonate with me. I see a lot of good utility and meaning in marketing a story featuring competent and worldly young people to younger audiences, because teenagers seeing themselves in those kinds of almost unrealistically competent characters develops their own self-image and helps cultivate serious emotions necessary for transitioning to adulthood. I can't remember where I read this, but I once read when I was a child that children think about big ideas like death and suffering and war and loss just as much as any adult. And unless I was a singularly weird child in that way, I think in my experience that's true. Giving young people characters like this is probably a net good for encouraging a cultivation of that side, as opposed to making them feel small by belittling them for daring to experience feelings we would associate with a mature worldview. Jesper is a surprisingly more grounded character by comparison. He comes off aloof and unserious, as well as hyper-competent for a 17-year-old, but his competency as a sharpshooter has a unique implied narrative explanation in one of the story's major twists, and I think his well-rounded characterization makes him more likable. He does 2 things really well, those being kill people with guns and make homoerotic quips, and I respect that. I hope now it's obvious why I brought up romance and sexuality in the beginning of this essay, as those topics have a serious background presence in the narrative at play in 6 of Crows. A story about a group of young people who have to grow up fast has the ability to present themes that will be important to young people who are beginning to encounter some of those feelings, but who have a limited to non-existent outlet for expressing them. Stories have the ability to dignify what young people are already feeling and what they already know in a way that I know upsets some people who are either legitimately concerned with the well-being of younger audiences, or who have a paternalistic, ideologically driven obsession with an image of people under the age of 18 as innocent. There is, however, a strong point of contrast between that idea about young readers and how young readers actually experience their own interior worlds. So on balance, I think having stories like this is important. Nina is one of those characters who, like Inej, has a background in doing something analogous to sex work, although in Inej's case it would be child trafficking and sex slavery, so it's not perfectly comparable. Nina is a Grisha, specifically something called a heart render, which means by day she soothes her clients by slowing their heart rates and making them feel at peace, working out of the House of the White Rose brothel while seemingly not being a sex worker herself, and working there more by choice than by force. Hopefully you can see why I'm making the comparisons I am. It's complicated. But by night, she can burst a person's heart if she has to, which is a neat little power, and she doesn't even need to write anyone's name in a notebook to pull it off. Her story is closely intertwined with Matthias, the only technical adult by our standards who still fits into the age range of the Crows by being just 18. Matthias is basically the in-universe equivalent of a witch hunter, only his witches are real. Leigh Bardugo says in an interview printed in the back of the book that Matthias was her favorite character to write because he's so dogmatic, and I think that's a perfect word for him. It's also what makes him so interesting to read, because it sets him at odds with other characters, even as he struggles with how he, especially in the case of Nina, really has some affection for them. Matthias and Nina's story is one of overcoming cultural conditioning and bigotry, which sets it among the more mature subplots of Six of Crows and makes their dynamic my absolute favorite. The plot proceeds as you might expect. Six of Crows is a heist novel. Kaz is the de facto leader of a gang of criminals competing in the slums of a big trade hub when bloody murder strikes the magical echelons of the upper crust. All of a sudden, his very particular set of skills has him working for one of the rich gentlemen he despises, and he recruits his own small infiltration team in kind. Their target is essentially a military fortress, part prison, part training ground, part religious site, and all magical ice castle filled with the Grishaverse equivalent of inquisitorial witchfinders. Kaz and the crew enter disguised as prisoners in the hopes of slipping away and infiltrating the ballroom on the upcoming holy holiday when the fortress will be visited by members of the public. I'll keep things spoiler-free here, but it's exactly what you'd expect from a fantasy heist novel, and for this kind of literature, it's a good time. If I'm being fully vulnerable with you all, I recall the first and only other time I read Six of Crows as being less engaging than this reread. I remembered most of the general contours of the narrative and the characters, but while Bardugo's twists still managed to emerge as pleasant surprises based on forgotten details, what really changed wasn't how well I followed the plot. The plot of the story is highly standardized. A machine could have structured the general shape of it. Alternatively, it's inoffensively normal, the kind of thing you generally don't want art to be unless it has a killer B-side. Six of Crows is just like that. I have to convince you of my readiness to hate this book. I've primed you, hopefully, to have an appreciation for the utility of young adult literature, but at the outset of my reread, I wasn't fully convinced. There was still, and in some ways remains, a part of me that wants to say that people who constantly read nothing but young adult lit need to read more books. I'll amend that to say we all need to read more books, but Bardugo's novel, while it makes for relatively easy reading, has a voice that I don't recall from my first read nearly a decade ago. For every moment when I finally felt that Six of Crows had given me a passage too edgy or too cringy for me not to bring it up in this essay to make a little fun, it turned out that Bardugo's style was just easy enough on the eyes that I kept going. I even soldiered through some of the memified passages and some of the Inej sections that I liked least, usually ones where her narration can't help but fawn over Kaz Brecker like he's the most amazing person in the whole world. It's a little sickening, especially the section where they pose as prisoners, but Bardugo's delivery carried me through even that cavalcade of effuse heterosexuality. I liked Jesper more than I remembered. Actually, now that I give it some more thought, I think Kaz is probably a better Tumblr sexy men archetype, and I just need to learn to think more like a woman capable of feeling attraction to men. I really started to wonder what was wrong with me when I was reading about how Matthias growled something or other for the umpteenth time, a little trope from young adult fiction and romance that I genuinely can't stand in how so many female writers write male love interests. But I think it's more than just whether the characters are charming. The real charm is Bardugo's own personal flair. I went from wanting to report the pros and cons of Six of Crows to feeling satisfied that I had read the thing. It wasn't difficult going, even for my ADHD brain, although some sections were more gripping than others, but I liked my time with it. If that wasn't true and I invested even a little time for no good reason, you'd all hear about it, but instead, I just think it's kind of a good book. I'm not going to reach to tell you that a well-made, decently put-together work of art is bad or trashy just for clicks. I think that has to be one of the most toxic features of our social media landscape when it comes to discussions of media, and as it happens, it's also why I decided to reread this book. This essay might seem a bit off the wall. It may occur to you to ask why, if I think the book isn't the absolute best, or if young adult literature isn't my favorite genre, would I feel the need to defend Leigh Bardugo's Six of Crows from anything. The last time I wrote an essay in defense of something, I prioritized giving what I hoped was fair pushback on takes I had seen floating around the internet about Peter Jackson's The Hobbit films, as well as some negative criticism I vaguely remembered the Nostalgia Critic giving to the Rankin and Bass animated version. It was the same then, on an even more lo-fi setup than I'm on now, and with even worse scripting and editing. I just don't like taking absolutist stances on the quality of a work of media. There's too many variables to engaging with art to let a definite take on a film or a book stand in such black and white terms, as much as that's probably what the algorithm and a number of viewers want. The way I see it, this time I should dot more of my I's and cross more of my T's. So I'll show you, rather than tell you, why I felt the need to make this thing, which ended up being a lot more work than probably comes across here or than I even really expected. We're going to talk about that one TikTok controversy. Before we do, let's get the natural preamble out of the way. Do not harass or send negativity to any of the people shown or discussed here. This is a channel where constructive critique is welcome, but destructive drama is not. Hate or vitriol directed towards other participants in these conversations serves no positive end, and capitalizing on hate or vitriol created by others can perpetuate the cycle of pain and immiseration that takes us further away from learning and from genuine human connection. Nothing I say here is intended as a takedown of anyone, and if anyone mentioned here does see this, I hope you have a pleasant day and my audience receives you well. With that said, what you are about to watch is a pair of TikToks created by the channel Yana Reads. She has a lot of followers, at least as far as I can tell, and seems to mostly discuss romance literature, the subject matter, not the art movement. But at one point in 2024, she was recommended Six of Crows. It seems like she didn't really connect with it, and I hope the way I've opened this essay shows how easily that could happen. I had a similar, albeit less negative experience for different reasons. I remember how many people were talking about how good that book was. I first read it within a year of it being published and recall a certain amount of buzz around it. So it just being alright felt odd to me. I knew I liked fantasy literature, I just couldn't really point to anything in particular about the book that I hated. I didn't even really dislike it, but just rather found it a bit underwhelming. Let's see some of what Yana had to say.
I do have an update for you. I actually got through a lot of Six of Crows yesterday. I'm on page 155 now, and the only reason I got through it so much of this book is because I was reading it on the Kindle. Because once again, the tiny words and how many words there are per page wasn't doing it for me.
That was from one of the TikToks that's still up, but she actually took a couple videos down either temporarily or permanently from what I can see. I'm still not a big TikTok user, so there's an element of this conversation we haven't gotten to yet. You can probably tell this also wasn't her first video about the fact that she was reading the book. What's odd to me is that the print size of the font and the word count per page are the kinds of things you could eyeball by looking at a copy. So I have to figure if it was an issue, she'd just start with the Kindle version. I suppose maybe she thought it would be fine but turned out to be wrong. Overall, she got some heat for this take, but it doesn't come off that egregious at all. However, if we look at a previous video, we can get some insight into what she might have meant by this.
In my last video, when I asked you what book you guys think I should be reading, you all yelled at me and said Six of Crows is what you're supposed to read. It's the best book fucking ever. So anyway, I trusted you and I started it last night. Do I have an update for you? I mean, not really. I'm on page 34. Can we talk about something real quick though? Can I just talk shit for a second? Why the fuck is this book? First of all, the writing is so tiny. Second of all, why are the pages so filled with so many words? What the fuck?
Hopefully those clips will give you all a sense of context for what the first clip I showed you all was about. I'm trying to keep things brief here. I get the sense that the book was not living up to the hype for Yana, and I sympathize with that perspective, because I agree. Six of Crows is overhyped. I think sometimes we need to learn to just sell people on things. If you oversell in the pitch, you'll underwhelm in the product, and that strategy might work if all you care about is making a sale, but I think people try to sell others on art for additional reasons, like creating a shared bond over the book. You'll fail at that over and over again if you overhype things, even if the things aren't really that bad. I also feel the need to be fair to Yana on the basis that she admits she's talking shit, so this isn't a problem of self-awareness per se. I think upon further reflection, a lot of people responded to her as if she was stupid, and that's really unfortunate, even if you think it's true, because it encouraged some people to come away with the wrong idea. I myself had to rethink what she might have meant by this. Let's take one more look at another subsequent TikTok of hers that I could no longer find on her page before drawing conclusions.
No, 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 no. To every single person that's ever loved this book, I don't mean it in any disrespectful way, but I absolutely hated every single second of this. And to be quite honest, I don't know what you were expecting from me, okay? Take a look at my bio. So when you're recommending me this, what did you expect me to say? It's a fucking heist, for God's sake. Like, a heist. Do I look like that's something I would enjoy? No.
Again, I want to keep things as brief as possible because this was just the provocation for making this video. I saw these videos, I saw other ones Yenna made, I saw comments and jokes, I saw stitches and discourses, and this seemed like something people really felt passionate about. I even got baited into reacting to this stuff, and I feel bad, because it's easier to point at someone on the internet and laugh, but it's a lot more challenging to engage with them for the sake of curiosity and growth. In an attempt to be complimentary, I will say that Yenna succeeded in teasing sincere emotions out of people. I wanted to investigate her criticism about the font size and the words per page that I mentioned earlier, because this was where a lot of people's minds went. I suppose it's possible she literally didn't look at the specifics of the book's listing before buying her copy. You can usually tell what the size of the print will be by looking at the dimensions of the pages, because if the book is physically smaller, it likely needs slightly smaller text to fit the same number of words per page. But let's do some comparing and contrasting to see if her remarks hold water. Here's some copies of books that I own. You can see the books and the pages with the font size in these bad pictures. I have a copy of all three J.R.R. Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings books all in one, a favorite print version of mine. I also have a copy of George R.R. Martin's A Storm of Swords, which I've come back to recently for some artistic inspiration. Finally, I've got Trick Weeks' The Masked Empire, the subject of a recent Patreon video. The Masked Empire has a smaller font size as it's physically the smallest book, and The Lord of the Rings has a font size marginally on the smaller side as well. A Storm of Swords has a relatively large font for the dimensions of its pages, but the way it's printed groups the text together in a way that makes it look a bit blockier. I would rate The Masked Empire as the most accessible of these texts, being very accessible, with The Lord of the Rings being the least accessible, and A Storm of Swords being somewhere in the middle. Perhaps some would say Martin leans more towards the Tolkien end of that spectrum. Weeks was writing a video game tie-in, after all. But you know who doesn't lean towards the Tolkien end of the spectrum? J.K. Rowling sure doesn't, and if we look at my copy of Harry Potter and the Half-Blood Prince, we can see the size of its font and pages. Compare this with my favorite hardcover copy of Six of Crows, and you can see that the font size, words per page, and page size all correspond relatively nicely. However, the copy that Yenna got is this less impressive paperback, and I love paperbacks, I promise, which has this shorter front cover called a step back cover, and doesn't have the black fade on the edges of the pages. If we look at this font size, it's closer to the size of the text in the copy of The Lord of the Rings that I showed you before, but the words per page is still close to the hardcover copy of Harry Potter that I showed you. I know there will be people who will say what I saw in the comment sections already, which is that people could have visual impairments or other disabilities that make reading print harder. And while that's completely understandable, it also never came up in any of Yenna's videos about Six of Crows that I saw, and if that problem was consistent, it would be more something she should handle on her end without any guilt rather than a problem with the book. She brought it up like it was an issue with Six of Crows. She also presented the number of words per page as a problem, but like I showed you earlier, there isn't a ton of difference between the different copies with the different fonts in terms of how many words there are on the page, comparable also to Harry Potter. If that's true, and Harry Potter is too difficult, what books do happen to be accessible by that standard? How many sentences are supposed to exist on a single page? 20? 10? What does this have to do with Six of Crows? And while you're at it, leave a comment on this video about whether I should finally do that video about the Harry Potter series, because it's been like an itch that I've just refused to scratch, because every time I think about rolling I want to vomit. No, I really don't think this has a ton to do with reviewing Six of Crows, and while I can understand the struggles of being disabled or neurodivergent and wanting to consume literature, I think that barring some cases, it's not really good to invoke disabled people just to prove that hypothetically someone on the internet could have been right if they made a different argument. That feels immature to me, although not as immature as harassing a TikToker. I think one of the reasons Yenna receives so much negativity, besides, misogyny, is that she's clearly trying to be provocative. If I had to guess, and I realize we can't know for sure without her input, that would probably be why she emotes these feelings so heavily. She's a content creator. She's creating content. The expectation is that she will be entertaining and grab your attention when you're already half a second from scrolling past her. That's a tough gig, so she's acting provocative. We see this everywhere, so it would be mature of us to, at least within reason, approach the situation with enough rationality to know she's probably not literally doing and saying these things for no reason. That does, of course, come with the caveat that I think her reasons for dissing Six of Crows are mostly bullshit. The only thing that makes sense to me is that she might be emoting for effect while simply admitting she didn't have a good time. Maybe that's overly charitable, but I'm trying. It could be a real and legitimate feeling. I do think that she knows what she likes and this wasn't it. The internet, however, is the kind of place where, when we act like clowns, we get put in the circus, as much as the environment does seem to indicate that clowning is a viable market force. I disagreed with what Yana had to say, because it seemed like she was grasping for awkward and uncompelling rationalizations of her preferences, and wouldn't you know it, a number of other people did too. There have been a few responses to Yana's videos. I'd only like to show you the ones that I felt were defensible or which otherwise made points worth developing further here.
Fantasy books and like reading fantasy is not for everybody, right? Like there's so much that goes into jumping into a fantasy book because the author is spending so much time at the beginning like creating the world that you have now entered into, with like, you know, the new characters, if there's like powers, if there's the lore, that like everything. There's a lot going on all at once and you're just kind of jumping in there. So I completely get that. Not everybody was built that way. I'm an avid fantasy reader myself, so it's something that I really enjoy and that I'm really used to, but like she probably is not, and that's okay. Like at one point in the video she reads a sentence, and because she was complaining about how hard it was to like understand what was going on, and she reads a sentence and the sentence is literally like made up names of towns in the world, and she's like, what does that mean? Like, it's not supposed to mean anything, it's a place.
Heist, for God's sake, like a heist. Do I look like that's something I would enjoy? No.
Ketterdam, a bustling hub of international trade where anything can be had for the right price. And no one knows that better than criminal prodigy Kaz Brecker. Kaz is offered a chance at a deadly what? What do we think it's gonna be? A deadly threesome? A deadly sex in a hockey rink? Maybe a deadly living in the mountains with stepbrothers? Let's find out at a deadly heist. What did you think was gonna happen?
I think that these videos come across as good faith criticism, and I think they're relatively fair rebuttals. From Yana's point of view, I imagine there's a difficulty in balancing being recommended this book by so many people with knowing it's not her preferred reading material. Still, the thing that was interesting to me is that the comments on these videos seemed at least as negative as the ones on Yana's videos that I could see. Obviously, these other creators weren't receiving the same share of negativity on-site or off-site, but you'd figure that if this was a one-sided harassment campaign, driven by some kind of central source, then it would be more consistent, and it makes me wonder whether this isn't just how TikTok is. We used to think YouTube comment sections were toxic, and they are, but man, I do not think I will be making content for TikTok anytime soon. People who leave comments on TikTok videos type like they're filling out forms, only it's the most rude, ignorant, and incoherent thing you've read all day. I can't recommend it. I felt Yana's criticisms were undercooked in the extreme. Her videos about Six of Crows consisted mostly of remarks about how the words on the page visually appeared, the genre, the fact that there were flashbacks, and the fact that the book centers around a heist. In her defense, she knows what she likes, and this wasn't it. However, in the defense of her critics, it feels wrong somehow to imply that you should be able to make those criticisms of a work of art in an incendiary manner and not expect some amount of that energy to be returned to you. Yana should be able to make videos without getting harassed on the internet. However, I strongly feel that if you forward certain kinds of criticism, there's a baseline where your audience is allowed to draw a line. Maybe where they even should be obligated to draw a line. Does that mean that all is fair in discourse and fandom toxicity? Well, I'm not sure about that either. I actually don't know if I think we should be acting this way at all. While I was writing this essay, a YouTube video from a YouTuber named Drew Gooden, who I watch semi-regularly, popped up in my feed. Drew tends to come across as a relatively calm and collected but still thoughtful creator who says things that provoke me to self-reflection, and his video "Everybody Wants to Waste Your Time" definitely did so. Specifically, I myself have wondered, as I experimented with essay formats, whether it wouldn't be better to produce more short-form content when I write an essay, which is why my Patreon videos lately have been exactly like that. I know Drew said his criticism, which I thought was quite measured, wasn't directed at smaller content creators who are just trying to do things to get noticed, so of course I didn't take it personally, but I still like to learn from what people have to say about that sort of thing. Was it really necessary to talk about every Dark Souls area and boss in the Dark Souls retrospective? Probably not. It didn't need to be 6 hours long. Should I have cut more of the story of the Wolfenstein games when I wrote that video? Probably. At the time, it felt like the games were so story-centric that it would be a waste not to speak on all the moments that I found so touching, but in hindsight, that means there's a lot of summarizing in that video, which is never a great thing. It's not that shorter essays are always better. I still like both of those videos more than a lot of the stuff I've made that was much shorter, but it's something to keep in mind. I bring all of this up because, while I was reflecting on Drew's video, I was surprised to hear him share this anecdote.
I was scrolling one day and I saw someone say, iCarly, Victorious, Zoe 101. And at first I had to squint for a few seconds because I wasn't sure what they meant by this. And then I realized they were saying the first two are good, LeBron James, and the third is sort of an imposter that doesn't belong. And I, in my head, got defensive. I was like, what are you talking about? Zoe 101 was good. It was certainly better than Victorious. How does this have so many likes? What's wrong with Zoe 101? And then I exited out of Twitter and sat in silence for a few seconds as I pondered what just happened. How I got upset that someone I don't know said a show from 20 years ago that I kind of liked isn't as good as a different show that I barely watch. Why is this how I'm spending my time? In this moment, I could have been doing anything else, and yet I chose to introduce this argument into my head? That can't be good long term, right? Like, we can all agree that's probably not great for my brain.
The thing about this clip that stands out to me, and the thing that makes it feel relevant here, is how well it speaks to the fact that the lingua franca of so many diverse people and perspectives on the internet trying to connect with each other is rage. Anger is the bridge we keep crossing to meet over things we care about. Algorithms incentivize this by, in the case of YouTube, further promoting those videos with elements that get the most engagement. I'm not sure if Twitter is the same way. They seem to have a boost this post if it's written by a neo-Nazi function in there somewhere, but a lot of websites appear to have similar, albeit distinct, features. The more people click on a video, the more YouTube knows it should show that video to more people, with the understanding that they're likely to click on it as well. However, algorithms themselves cannot differentiate whether the words and images in the titles and thumbnails of videos are going to make you happy or sad without being told that information. They can only know what information they're given, which in this case is whether you clicked on the video after being shown it a certain number of times, whether you liked or disliked, how much of the video you watched, and that sort of thing. If you make content for the internet, you've probably heard about so-called power words, and if you don't, this is why so many video essays have titles like The Incredibles, An Unforgettable Masterpiece, or The Sad Downfall of Disney, using words that imply not only a strong emotion, but also a fresh and provocative one has the potential to draw in massive audiences, and if a YouTuber does it enough, they're almost guaranteed to have a hit or two where they harness the unbridled rage or tearful nostalgia of their audience. I have a video where I talk about how, over time, online geek fandom culture lost a lot of the irony in consuming videos where a guy screams at a video game character and just started reproducing that behavior unironically, to the point where now there are entire audiences who take it as a point of pride that their favored creator is genuinely angry in their videos. When you rage about geek culture, you're speaking a language that is endemic to these online spaces. It's like a disease to which we've slowly become not immune but accustomed, and which can have cognitively disabling effects on our ability to behave like empathetic humans. Of course, that's just a metaphor, but internet nerds developing a version of the Pontypool virus that causes them to act like hateful people isn't new, and it isn't going away. It feels like this is everything now. Some time ago, veteran fantasy author George R.R. Martin wrote a touching blog post about how many writers of his generation in the science fiction and fantasy genres had passed away. I know Martin himself is older, so it may be that he feels his generation is fading away, and the thought scares me enough that it must present something of a puzzler, I assume, even to a more knowledgeable and experienced person. That blog post also contained one brief passage that got some attention in the media. Here it is. Quote, "Well, I take solace where I can, in chocolate thrones if nowhere else, in books, in films and television shows, though even there toxicity is growing. It used to be fun talking about our favorite books and films, and having spirited debates with fans who saw things different. But somehow in this age of social media, it is no longer enough to say I did not like book X or film X, and here's why. Now social media is ruled by anti-fans who would rather talk about the stuff they hate than the stuff they love, and delight in dancing on the graves of anyone whose film has flopped." End quote. It's hard to say whether we are a culture that delights in wanton cruelty or whether we have simply developed into one over a very great length of time. Perhaps this is just the internet manifesting something much more deeply entrenched and powerful that has been set in motion in our history. I certainly don't think this is irretrievably the way that we are. Maybe it's not a problem that raising awareness can solve. What I do know is that if we behave this way, we're making a bargain. As long as we engage in cruelty, cruelty is what we will receive. As long as we continue down that path, our culture, from writers to readers, will be at war with itself, and we will be splitting our souls and piecing them back together just to hurt each other all over again. This mood that I've been in recently reminds me of something else. The end of Yu Yu Hakusho. Specifically, there's a scene where Yusuke goes to talk to Genkai about his current feeling of malaise in between the arc where he fights Sensui and the arc with the demon tournament. I guess it's not really the very end, but it's always something that stuck with me. In one of the manga translations, I remember the way Genkai's dialogue came across very well. She says, "We're all capable of thoughtless destruction. Imagine first, though, what you might destroy." It was a compelling message to me when I was younger, but I think now, as I'm starting to get older, I really understand what that meant. I should thank Yoshihiro Togashi for the lesson. Maybe that's what this is all about. I've turned 30 and I'm becoming even more cognizant of how my words and actions can affect others. It's definitely happened to me before, both in my 20s and when I was growing up, so I guess it's no surprise. I've spent a certain amount of ink and breath in this essay asking the question of whether the way that Yana was treated for her Six of Crows TikToks was fair. As I hope I've shown, that question remains hopeless to answer. On the one hand, she indelicately tore into a sincere work of art. On the other hand, her feelings on the book should not themselves make her the target of excessive negativity. I also feel reluctance to admit everyone involved is somehow equally wrong, because a few people likely poked fun and thought nothing of it, just as presumably a non-zero amount of Yana's criticism was her genuine reaction to what she was experiencing, filtered through the medium of content creation for the sake of entertainment. It seems like there's no obvious villain in this story, at least none that I could see. I feel powerless to affect this state of affairs. Maybe, and I'm sure I've engaged in more than my allotted amount of speculation here as a creator, this is all a big cycle. Not just people lashing out at each other, but the sense of isolation and being unable to do anything about it except feed into it. Ultimately, the internet, this big web of many things that can inspire so much joy inherent in discovery, has also drawn us into a series of social relations where, for reasons new and strange, connecting with each other is somehow as difficult as ever. I would be remiss to not make a note of how many videos there are that criticize Six of Crows. It's not like Yana is the first, she won't be the last, obviously. You could use up an entire day just watching hours and hours of videos on YouTube alone criticizing, raving, and even just rambling about Six of Crows. I know I did to write this video. Some of you here probably came for that kind of thing. I'd hate to disappoint you, even though I feel it's my moral obligation at this point to treat this issue as sensitively as I can. Instead, let's look at some informative perspectives that might add something we haven't touched on yet. There are two videos in particular that I watched where I heard passing critiques of the book that struck a chord with me, and here they are.
This is not supposed to be a romance story. I've heard so many people say that these books are light on romance. If this is light on romance, what is heavy on romance? There's so much romance in these books. And again, something I hate in books is when it happens or like comes up in the most ridiculous of situations. They will literally have, this one couple has their first kiss while other members of their group are like discussing really important, essential life matters that are super relevant, and there's other people just like watching them, and then they have their first kiss and like a makeout session all in front of them, and I'm like, what the fuck?
And another thing that, although in the plot that I didn't so much enjoy, is in revealing a lot of these backstories. Almost all of these characters have like a villain, right? They have like that one person that just screwed them over so many times, and I would say things happen in this book that are a little bit too convenient, right? And I get it. You want it to be satisfying, but I felt like they take the heist outside of the city, right? And I wish this book, they was just like in the city of Ketterdam, right? It's dark, it's gritty. I wish they would have kept it local for the first book. They take them offshore, right? But then every single one of their backstory villains happen to be in the place that they're going. Like literally every single one would be like, and reveal who's around the corner. It's the person that I fear most in the world, and they're right behind the corner. And some of them make sense why they'd be there. Other ones, it's like, why are you here? And they all defeat them, and it's all too neat sometimes. It's all tied up in a bow, their little character arcs.
I think both of these clips from both of these reviews by Ivy Muse and Toasty Towns represent a similar perspective on two different elements in Six of Crows, and it rings true to me as well. Leigh Bardugo has been criticized for a few elements of her writing, as some of you may know, and we've done some of that ourselves here. But this is one of the ones that fits into this section of the video because I think it's actually underrepresented in public criticism for how pervasive it is in the book. It's not terrible, but she does lean heavily on Chekhov's gun in the romance and rivalry dynamics of the story. All of the Six Crows have a romantic interest, one of each other, and a rival, an antagonist in the story, that appear in the book enough to at least partially satisfy a reader who might have wanted more if things had been otherwise. That's in part a defense of the choice, but it's also a criticism. Consider Chekhov's gun as a trope. Chekhov's gun is a principle for playwrights as advocated by Anton Chekhov, a famous Russian writer. The principle goes that in a play, for example, a gun that appears on a mantle above a fireplace must be fired before the play concludes. The idea is that the gun needs a reason for being a part of the set's architecture. A less literal interpretation might argue that if it's not actually fired in the play, maybe at one point the character who owns the home in which that set is featured makes reference to his days as a soldier, or later in the play the character references going hunting. The piece should have utility, Chekhov argued, and in principle I think this is a good starting position for new writers. You always learn the rules of writing before you break them, and just as omit needless words is a fundamental of writing, omit needless architecture might be a useful tool for minimalist set design in the theater. One can, of course, break this rule, but beginning from this place is instructive. As Strunk and White's The Elements of Style puts it, quote, vigorous writing is concise. A sentence should contain no unnecessary words, a paragraph no unnecessary sentences, for the same reason that a drawing should have no unnecessary lines, and a machine no unnecessary parts, end quote. In his introduction to his former professor's quote-unquote little book, E.B. White added the following, quote, style rules of this sort are, of course, somewhat of a matter of individual preference, and even the established rules of grammar are open to challenge. Professor Strunk, although one of the most inflexible and choosy of men, was quick to acknowledge the fallacy of inflexibility and the danger of doctrine. It is an old observation, he wrote, that the best writers sometimes disregard the rules of rhetoric. When they do so, however, the reader will usually find in the sentence some compensating merit, attained at the cost of the violation. Unless he is certain of doing as well, he will probably do best to follow the rules. It is encouraging to see how perfectly a book, even a dusty rulebook, perpetuates and extends the spirit of a man, end quote. The loose ends of Six of Crows are few and far between. I believe any critics who might feel prompted by convention to look for plot holes are misled. Its romance and rivalry share continuity, too much continuity. It is not entirely clear to me that Six of Crows benefits from its neat bow tying or relatively heavier share of romance. Each of those decisions compounds the others. It is not that Bardugo writes her romances and rivalries with excess words. Rather, the issue at hand is that those rules which we use for compensation of a machine's parts are useful also for the machines to which those machines are in turn only smaller parts. The book is a word machine, the story an idea machine. They are human machines, and so imperfection itself is their function. Ipso facto, our ability to ask this question in two contradictory directions reveals a tension in Six of Crows. How neat is too neat? How convenient is too convenient? In the words of the author Andrea Phillips on her blog Deus Ex Machinatio, continuity can be a real story killer. Once upon a time, this was going to be a short video. I swear I don't just do this because I have an unseriously disorganized mind or because I'm a poor writer. If anything, that's more of a yes-and situation. Sometimes once you start digging, you just can't help yourself. And that was quite true for me as I was developing my sense of how exactly to structure this essay. I wanted to talk about young adult literature in a charitable way. I wanted to talk about the experience of reading Six of Crows. I wanted to talk about the social media back and forth over comments about this novel, and I wanted to treat those with charity too. I hope that I have done my best. In the end, however, I have to talk about propaganda. I've had some difficulty getting the full scope of this idea across to basically anyone and everyone I've ever tried to run it by, so this is my first attempt at actually really crystallizing it in simple language. But the thing about social media is that it's also mass media. It is mass-produced, it is mass-distributed, and it is both produced and distributed for the masses to consume. The literature we read is mass media, the radio and records to which we listen are mass media. The movies and television we watch are mass media too, as is streaming, whether it's a paid service or a publicly accessible site hosting content creators. TikTok and YouTube are mass media. The laws of mass media, not necessarily all the government regulations, but the less perceptible yet more inevitable ironclad laws emergent from its properties, are as evident here as anywhere else. I have for you a very simple proposition. There is, in my mind, a distinction between art and propaganda. Most people I know don't make this distinction. To them, propaganda is merely any attempt to imprint one's own ideals and values onto another. In this sense, anything from a gentle conversation to Birth of a Nation is basically different shades of the same color, if you'll pardon the atrocious pun. To my mind, this categorization misses a key component of propaganda: absence of good pedagogy. Pedagogy and propaganda are enemies infringing on each other's territory. The Brazilian academic Paulo Freire lived an amazing life and wrote a book that became foundational to the ideas of many educators and thinkers across the world. That book, Pedagogy of the Oppressed, has helped me formalize some ideas I had which were disorganized, as well as to develop some of my ideas which were, as of yet, unarticulated. It is a technically common, but emotionally precious thing for a reader to feel they have found a book with which their connection is so profound that the act of reading it causes them to believe they have already felt and thought the things that the text induced in them prior to even having read it. It is a way of both feeling and intellectually realizing a personal truth. It connects the inner you that is your mental person composed of pieces of your experiences with others with the outer you that is your physical person encountered by others in similar experiences. Reading can make you feel like you're meeting your own self. It's a beautiful thing for growth. I hope now my recommendation that everybody read more appears genuine. On the subject of pedagogy, liberation, and propaganda, Freire writes that, quote, "The correct method for a revolutionary leadership to employ in the task of liberation is, therefore, not libertarian propaganda. Nor can the leadership merely implant in the oppressed a belief in freedom, thus thinking to win their trust. The correct method lies in dialogue. The conviction of the oppressed that they must fight for their liberation is not a gift bestowed by the revolutionary leadership, but the result of their own conscientious agio. The revolutionary leaders must realize that their own conviction of the necessity for struggle, an indispensable dimension of revolutionary wisdom, was not given to them by anyone else, if it is authentic. This conviction cannot be packaged and sold. It is reached, rather, by means of a totality of reflection and action. Only the leader's own involvement in reality, within an historical situation, leads them to criticize this situation and to wish to change it. Likewise, the oppressed, who do not commit themselves to the struggle unless they are convinced, and who, if they do not make such a commitment, withhold the indispensable conditions for this struggle, must reach this conviction as subjects, not as objects. They must intervene critically in the situation which surrounds them and whose mark they bear. Propaganda cannot achieve this. While the conviction of the necessity for struggle, without which the struggle is unfeasible, is indispensable to the revolutionary leadership, indeed it was this conviction which constituted that leadership, it is also necessary for the oppressed. It is necessary, that is, unless one intends to carry out the transformation for the oppressed rather than with them. It is my belief that only the latter form of transformation is valid." End quote. What Freire is calling for here is a way of thinking and acting, a type of discourse which does not domesticate people in social struggles, but rather cooperates with them in their struggle. The importance of this quotation to me is also that it distinguishes between dialogue and propaganda in a useful way. When you think about the question of social oppression and marginalization, who it's happening to, where, and why, then the difference is important. With that distinction in mind, and seeing the way in which propaganda is effectively the tool of the authoritarian, it's useful also to think about how structures of authority shape mass media, such that even innocuous material is effectively curated in certain ways by power structures in a manner that causes it to, in whole or in part, resemble the values, ideals, and interests of those at the top of that social strata. If that sounds familiar, it's because it's a chief thrust of Manufacturing Consent by Noam Chomsky and Edward S. Herman, who open their argument by saying that, quote, "The raw material of news must pass through successive filters, leaving only the cleansed residue fit to print. They fix the premises of discourse and interpretation, and the definition of what is newsworthy in the first place, and they explain the basis and operations of what amount to propaganda campaigns. The elite domination of the media and marginalization of dissidents that results from the operation of these filters occurs so naturally that media news people, frequently operating with complete integrity and goodwill, are able to convince themselves that they choose and interpret the news objectively on the basis of professional news values. Within the limits of the filter constraints, they are often subjective. The constraints are so powerful and are built into the system in such a fundamental way that alternative bases of news are hardly imaginable." End quote. So, what is one interpersonal filter on these YouTube and TikTok spaces where video content is the chief medium? I think that one is obvious. It might seem to many people operating in these spaces that these can be inferred from mainstream media, but alternative mass media, including social media, also exists in response to mass media as much as anything else. So we have to make what inferences we can, not necessarily based on what we think is normal in our media landscape generally, but rather on what the rules of engagement are on these platforms. One in particular comes to mind: exaggerated emotionality. YouTubers who place their faces in the thumbnails of their uploads often specifically curate or have curated for them a series of images of themselves, appearing emotionally distraught or downright manic, but rarely evenly in between, rarely dull, always a little bit more extreme in their emotional range than would be normal for what is probably a less insane conversation than the one you might visually be led to believe you're about to witness. Video titles are similarly engaged in using power words, a term you'll have heard if you've read about how to market your videos to a wider audience. Power words are not just words that might describe strong emotions, they're also words that could solicit them or from which they might be inferred. Parallel to this, TikTok creators frequently open videos by speaking more loudly or provocatively before calming down, or starting out with a more provocative section of a video before reasserting where the discussion will begin. YouTubers have been doing previews for some time as well, where videos effectively show a bumper to grab and reel in the attention of audience members who, as opposed to being shown the video in a series of auto-played recommendations, will have clicked on the video out of what is likely casual but wavering interest. Emotion commands attention, and so an ironclad law of YouTube and TikTok would appear to be to invoke at least the initial appearance or aesthetic of strong emotions. You didn't just speak with the liberal college student, you destroyed her. That video game you heard about isn't just in an uncertain and unreleased state, it's confirmed woke garbage. That director of that one movie doesn't just have a different artistic direction for the series you like, she hates men, or something like that. Conversely, you may be assailed by videos about how a relatively decent film is actually a legendary masterpiece of some sort, with the most annoying version of this trend being the fence-sitter's delight of videos titled some variant of "Insert video game as a disappointing masterpiece." Those titles are not, by and large, merely being chosen because they represent an epiphany the individual who wrote them had about a work of art, but rather they are, on a large scale, being curated by the environment in which they are warring for attention. Good thing bad and bad thing good, done in the cheapest and laziest patterns possible, are my least favorite of these because I feel they mostly tend to demonstrate the least sincerity, which is the one thing I would hope a project spearheaded by an individual's vision would dare to have. The good version of this kind of essay is its big brother. Thing everybody else hates is good, or thing everybody else loves is bad, because it gets to benefit from the same algorithm-pleasing behavior while still staking out a definite position that presumably requires integrity to defend successfully. Extreme negative emotion is the cheaper and easier of these two in some ways, because if you're just affecting the outward appearance of a feeling, phony positive emotion often is interpreted as an indictment of the object of a false positivity, whereas phony negative emotion gets to be a bit, a joke, a gag, and half your audience will think you're joking about hating the thing and be pleased, and half your audience will think you're conveying your genuine distaste in a hyperbolic fashion. Put another way, hyperbolic positivity is saccharine, best suited for the taste buds of children, whereas hyperbolic negativity is spicy, which if nothing else makes a cheap meal taste better. On the subject of the two alternating interpretations of hyperbolic negativity, if you're a real piece of garbage, you'll try one of those approaches while saying you're doing the other. We call that Schrodinger's douchebag. However, in a world where it became obvious, through the great gamer event that shall not be named, that many consumers of games media were dissatisfied with the fact that, in order to get a review copy for games, reviewers needed to maintain a certain level of positivity with the product, rage became preferable for a sense of alternative sincerity. You will still find thousands of people on these websites who think like this. However, the abundance of that content in certain social spheres inherently implied the question, even to many of its more frequent viewers, of who was the most sincere. All of a sudden, the guy who does an angry character could come under fire for faking the rage, whereas a guy who is genuinely a toxic asshole becomes a stalwart fixture of an audience's media landscape. I bring this up not just to showcase the real attachment people have to their negativity and rage in what I hope is an empathetic light, but also to demonstrate how the same social forces that homogenize a lot of the art we consume also do the same thing to a lot of the art critique we consume. There's a video by a fellow small channel on YouTube called Josh from Xbox Live, and in the spirit of keeping my ideas accountable to their provocations, as with the previous sections, I want to share with you all something that he said that helped me finish this essay.
Despite our progressive aspirations, we remain binary people. We cling to simple dichotomies. We can't help but gravitate back to good guys versus bad guys. We love love, and we hate hate. We see these terms in direct opposition to each other, and choose one over the other. But I don't think these terms can be decoupled so easily, and to repress the one is to repress the other. What does it mean to be a hater? To be a hater is to be honest. To be a hater is to value truth over peace. To be a hater is to hold reality to a higher standard. To be a hater is to sharpen your insights to a knife point. To be a hater is to make yourself a thorn in the side of the culture industry, who make it their business to acquire everything meaningful, everything important, everything mythological, and grind it down into a homogeneous commercial paste. To hate the mediocre is to love the majestic. To hate the profane is to love the sacred. To hate content is to love art. To hate is to love. Haters do not advocate thoughtless negativity. They practice a learned heresy. Haters do not hate people, they hate ideas. Hating people is ugly, and haters are not ugly. Haters are sexy. I do love love, but I also love hate. And by loving hate, I transmute it from a dense emotion which controls me into a lightweight and playful way of engaging with the world. After all, hating hate only puts more negativity into the atmosphere. Loving hate is what the angels do.
I had been wanting to say something about toxic positivity at some point, but couldn't quite figure out how to work it in. Finding this video while in the final stages of making this essay was a perfect little opportunity, and funnily enough, despite the fact that I agree with this video's core message in a certain light, I find myself also disagreeing. The observations here are almost too big for me to deal with, and they were almost certainly too grand for Josh to really give his full thoughts on all of them in under 4 minutes. The weird thing about Josh's video is that it doesn't come off hateful. If anything, there's another word that comes to mind. Human. The need for negative emotional range is a human need, almost bordering on a right, a kind of basic entitlement, whose deprivation thereof is more of a curse than a blessing. Because Josh is right, repression isn't the way, and hate and love have an awful lot to do with each other. At the same time, there's a second trap here in these cultural discourses about toxic positivity. Josh seems to have noticed it implicitly, and if you watch his video in full, you'll probably see what I mean. To conceive of oneself as a brave truth-teller is at once noble and conceited, and in the spirit of the latter, it's a frequent excuse of people engaged in petty, small-minded, and ignorant behavior. Every asshole thinks they're the necessary asshole who tells it like it is, but this is self-flattery, a type of self-deception which is the enemy of truth. If we really believe in the fundamental necessity of our negative emotional range, we wouldn't need to justify its utility as a vulgar accessory to truth. We would appreciate its place in our lives because hatred is a sometimes brain food. And then there's the third trap as well. Josh's video is very moving, and watching it made me feel like it said a few things right in my head. However, I do have to object to his invocation of the culture industry. It's not that anything he said was explicitly wrong, but people might get the wrong idea. The visuals in his video draw on the George Lucas Star Wars films, Jurassic Park, and the older Indiana Jones films as a point of contrast with their later sequels. However, when Theodor Adorno and Max Horkheimer coined this idea, the culture industry, they weren't just saying new art had a problem, and as it happens, Dialectic of Enlightenment is based on their work from the middle of the 20th century before those films were ever made. They were making a broader critique of mass culture. The truth is that Star Wars and all the rest has always been a product of the culture industry. You can find art outside that avenue of production, but I didn't see a single thing on screen in that video that would be exempt from Adorno and Horkheimer's critique. Star Wars wasn't taken by the culture industry when Disney bought it, when the prequels were made, or even when the first sequel came out. That happened before the first film was ever released, when the impulses of George Lucas, the artist, were funneled into that mass culture industry. In the words of Adorno himself in the fittingly titled subsequent text, The Culture Industry, quote, "If indeed the advances of technology largely determine the fate of society, then the technicized forms of modern consciousness are also heralds of that fate. They transform culture into a total lie, but this untruth confesses the truth about the socioeconomic base with which it has now become identical. The neon signs which hang over our cities and outshine the natural light of the night with their own are comets presaging the natural disaster of society, its frozen death. Yet they do not come from the sky, they are controlled from Earth. It depends upon human beings themselves whether they will extinguish these lights and awaken from a nightmare which only threatens to become actual as long as men believe in it." End quote. We encounter so much art through content. It's true that the domesticating power of the implicit filters in industrial production of mass culture frequently have a harmful bias on art. Whether a book or film is good or bad isn't purely down to its relationship to the culture industry, but it feels like we as critics are never having that conversation properly, never holding both of those ideas in our minds at the same time. It's a lot like love and hate in that way. Personally, I find the obsession with what's good or bad to be less important than the content and context of how and why. Moreover, the nature of the culture industry is that it alters the mind, inures us to different ways of thinking, and shapes how we perceive our society. It is the fingerprint of propaganda on art. and when the invisible hand packages the art into content, even our pleasure and displeasure become alien. Our love and our hatred too, even our critique, which is really neither of the two former things but something else entirely, becomes something other than it was. This too is the culture industry, and with those quibbles voiced, I hope you can all be supportive of Josh as well as the other creators I brought up here, because I think they are trying their best and much good can come of it if they're enabled to be the best they can be. I have that faith for all of us. Six of Crows admits all comers. It is a book. I have no delusions about it being anything else. The ability to have written a book like Six of Crows, the ability to criticize a book like Six of Crows, the ability to respond to critiques of Six of Crows, these are all precious things to be defended. We need positive and negative emotional range in both our art and our criticism. In fact, we need to feel hatred as much as we sometimes need to cry. An outsider to humanity might imagine those sensations to be an unfortunate state of affairs, but we know better. I appreciate my pain, my sadness, my loneliness, my embarrassment, my failure, my loss, and all the minor tragedies and displeasures that give my life color. Some people wrongly believe that it is these negative emotions that allow us to contextualize our positive emotions. But for anyone else who has ever been in a mental state due to illness or drug use where you felt like you couldn't feel your feelings at all, you know that it's not so much that grief gives color to joy, but rather that both of these things fill a wide world, a vast ocean of experiences that we call being human. And that, dear viewer, is better than nothing.